You're lying on a straw mat in your family's farmhouse in 1758, burning with fever as red spots spread across your skin like deadly flowers blooming. Your mother weeps beside you, knowing these are the unmistakable marks of smallpox, the disease that has already claimed 3 of your siblings. The village healer, Isha, arrives with his wooden box of remedies, but his treatments are as likely to kill you as cure you. He might bleed you with rusty knives, force bitter herbs down your throat, or perform rituals to appease the angry spirits he believes have possessed your body. This isn't a story about primitive ignorance overcoming enlightened medicine, because in feudal Japan, there was no enlightened medicine to be found. This is the reality of falling sick in a world where disease was understood as divine punishment, where the same treatments used for broken bones were applied to deadly plagues, and where your survival depended less on medical knowledge than on pure, desperate luck. Today, we're entering the terrifying world of illness in feudal Japan, where getting sick meant facing a medical system that blended ancient Chinese traditions, folk superstitions, and dangerous experimentation into treatments that often accelerated death rather than prevented it. Introduction. The Edo period is remembered for its peace and cultural achievements, but this golden age was built on a foundation of constant medical terror that claimed lives with ruthless efficiency. Japan's isolation under the Sakoku policy created a unique medical landscape protected from some global pandemics, but completely unprepared for the diseases that did penetrate the islands. When illness struck, it devastated communities with apocalyptic force. The medical establishment was dominated by kanpo practitioners who followed traditional Chinese medicine principles adapted for Japan. These healers operated under the fundamental belief that illness resulted from imbalances in the body's vital energies, requiring treatments that often had no connection to actual disease processes. Life expectancy statistics reveal the brutal reality. The average person could expect to live only 35 to 40 years, with childhood mortality rates so high that families didn't name infants until they survived their first year. Disease was the primary killer, claiming more lives than war, famine, or natural disasters combined. The class system created dramatic differences in medical care. Wealthy samurai could afford elaborate treatments and multiple medical consultations, while peasants relied on folk remedies and village healers whose knowledge came from oral traditions rather than formal training. But perhaps most shocking was that even the best medical care available to the shogun himself was fundamentally ineffective against major diseases. When illness struck, social status provided psychological comfort, but offered little actual protection against death. The arrival of Western medicine through Dutch studies, Rangaku, in the later Edo period, began to challenge traditional practices, but this knowledge remained confined to a small elite of scholars who struggled against centuries of entrenched medical tradition. Regional variations in medical practice created a patchwork of different approaches across Japan, with some areas developing relatively sophisticated techniques, while others remained dependent on religious healing and folk magic. Chapter 1. The Healers and Their Methods. In 1687, a physician named Yamawaki Toyo in Kyoto shocked the medical establishment by conducting Japan's first recorded human dissection, discovering that traditional Chinese anatomical texts were fundamentally wrong. The human liver had 2 lobes, not 3 as ancient texts claimed. The medical practitioners of feudal Japan operated within a system that prioritized theoretical knowledge over empirical observation, creating treatments based on philosophical principles rather than understanding of actual disease mechanisms. Kanpo doctors formed the backbone of Japan's medical establishment, practicing a system imported from China that emphasized balancing the body's qi, or vital energy. These practitioners diagnosed illnesses by examining patients' pulses, observing their tongues, and analyzing their qi patterns. The diagnostic process involved elaborate pulse reading techniques where doctors claimed to detect dozens of different pulse types, each supposedly indicating specific internal conditions. A slippery pulse meant phlegm accumulation, while a wiry pulse indicated liver problems, determinations made without any understanding of actual cardiovascular function. Traditional treatments centered on herbal medicine preparations called toyaku, complex mixtures of plant, animal, and mineral ingredients boiled into bitter teas. These prescriptions could contain dozens of components, from common ginseng to exotic ingredients like powdered rhinoceros horn or bear gallbladder. Acupuncture and moxibustion formed core treatment methods based on theories about energy meridians running through the body. Practitioners inserted needles or burned mugwort on specific points, believing this would redirect qi flow and restore health. The shocking reality was that many traditional treatments were actively harmful. Mercury-based medicines caused poisoning, excessive bloodletting weakened patients fighting infections, and some herbal preparations contained toxic compounds that added kidney or liver damage to existing illnesses. Folk healers, Minkan Ryo Hoshi, served rural communities with treatments that blended medical practice with religious ritual. These practitioners might prescribe herbal remedies alongside prayers, amulets, and ceremonies designed to appease disease-causing spirits. The Onmyoji tradition treated illness as supernatural affliction, using divination, exorcism, and ritual purification rather than physical treatments. For many Japanese, especially during epidemics, spiritual healing seemed as reasonable as medical intervention. Surgical knowledge remained extremely limited throughout most of the Edo period. The few surgical procedures attempted were crude operations performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or understanding of infection, making surgery a desperate last resort that often killed patients through trauma or post-operative complications. The introduction of Dutch medical knowledge through Rangaku scholars began to challenge traditional practices, but this new learning remained confined to a tiny elite. Most Japanese continued to receive traditional treatments throughout the period. Training for medical practitioners varied wildly in quality. Some studied for years under established masters, while others learned through trial and error in their communities. There were no standardized medical schools or licensing requirements for most of the period. Chapter 2: The diseases that terrorized Japan. In 1858, as cholera swept through Edo, a merchant named Ichi-Emon recorded in his diary how the disease struck his neighborhood like an invisible demon that killed healthy people within hours, turning their skin blue and their bodies cold while they still lived. The diseases that plagued feudal Japan created cycles of terror that shaped every aspect of daily life, with certain illnesses becoming so feared that their very names were spoken in whispers. Smallpox remained the greatest killer throughout the Edo period, claiming lives across all social classes with ruthless efficiency. An early 19th century saying went, "Smallpox determines one's appearance. Measles determines one's life," with a case fatality rate of up to 25% among children under 5. The disease was so common that parents didn't consider children truly alive until they survived their bout with smallpox. Families would prepare for the inevitable infection by stocking special foods, arranging religious ceremonies, and sometimes even holding preemptive funeral preparations. When cholera first reached Japan in the mid-19th century, it killed with terrifying speed. The 1858 outbreak in Edo claimed between 100,000 and 300,000 lives, the ukiyo-e artist Utagawa Hiroshige among them. Healthy people could die within 24 hours of first symptoms. Tuberculosis, known as chest disease, mune no yamai, was a slow killer that consumed victims over months or years. The disease spread easily in crowded urban areas and poorly ventilated homes, creating chronic health crises that entire communities couldn't escape. Measles struck in devastating cycles, particularly when combined with other epidemics. The 1862 outbreak coincided with cholera, creating a medical catastrophe that overwhelmed Edo's capacity to care for the sick or bury the dead. Parasitic infections were nearly universal. Most Japanese carried intestinal worms that caused chronic malnutrition and weakened resistance to other diseases. Childhood diseases like diphtheria and whooping cough killed infants at horrific rates, contributing to the practice of not naming children until they survived their most vulnerable early years. Chapter 3: When Epidemics Struck. In 1862, during the Great Cholera epidemic that devastated Edo, a doctor named Ogata Koan wrote desperately to his colleagues that the disease moves faster than our understanding, killing patients before we can even attempt treatment. We are fighting an invisible enemy with weapons made of paper. Epidemic diseases transformed feudal Japanese society into scenes from nightmares, where normal life collapsed under waves of death that medical knowledge couldn't explain or prevent. The speed of epidemic diseases overwhelmed Japan's limited medical infrastructure. Cholera could kill healthy adults within 24 hours of first symptoms, while smallpox epidemics could claim 30% of a community's population in a single outbreak cycle. Community responses to epidemics blended practical public health measures with desperate spiritual interventions. Villages would quarantine affected households, but they would also organize mass prayers, processions, and offerings to appease the spirits believed to be causing the outbreak. The urban environment of Edo made epidemic control nearly impossible. With over 1 million residents packed into poorly ventilated buildings, diseases spread through neighborhoods like wildfire, overwhelming the capacity of even wealthy districts to care for their sick. Medical authorities had no understanding of disease transmission mechanisms, leading to treatments and prevention strategies that often accelerated rather than controlled epidemics. Doctors might prescribe group treatments that brought infected and healthy people together, unwittingly spreading diseases further. Economic disruption during epidemics created secondary crises that prolonged suffering. Markets closed, food supplies were disrupted, and normal trade relationships collapsed as communities focused solely on survival. The psychological impact of epidemics created lasting trauma in affected communities. Survivors developed elaborate superstitions and religious practices designed to prevent future outbreaks, many of which persisted for generations after the original crisis. Children orphaned by epidemics often faced abandonment or death, as extended families and communities lacked resources to care for additional dependents during ongoing health crises. Regional isolation during epidemics could protect some communities but also meant that affected areas received no external assistance. Villages might be completely cut off from outside contact for months, forced to endure epidemics without any external medical support. Government responses to epidemics were often inadequate and sometimes counterproductive. Official policies might mandate treatments that had no medical benefit while failing to address sanitation and public health issues that contributed to disease spread. The timing of epidemics often coincided with other crises like famines or military conflicts, creating compound disasters that stretched survival resources beyond their limits and multiplied death tolls beyond what disease alone would have caused. Recovery from major epidemics required years or decades, as communities had to rebuild not just their population, but also their economic and social structures that had been destroyed by mass mortality. Chapter 4: Treatments That Killed. In 1720, a samurai named Watanabe Kazan documented his family's treatment for his young son's fever. Repeated bloodletting, forced consumption of mercury-based medicines, and ritualistic burning of moxa on the child's skin, treatments that likely accelerated the boy's death rather than provided any healing. The medical treatments available in feudal Japan were often more dangerous than the diseases they were supposed to cure, creating a healthcare system where seeking help could be a death sentence. Bloodletting was prescribed for almost every illness. Doctors used crude knives to open veins, often causing blood loss that weakened patients who needed strength to fight infections. Mercury-based medicines created poisoning symptoms worse than the original illness: kidney damage, neurological problems, sometimes death. Yet doctors continued prescribing them for everything from syphilis to stomach pain. Herbal preparations contain dozens of ingredients, including arsenic and lead compounds. The bitter irony? Treatments designed to heal often killed faster than the diseases they were meant to cure. Moxibustion involved burning mugwort directly on skin, creating deliberate burns that frequently became infected. Doctors believed these wounds would redirect energy flows. Instead, they added dangerous complications to existing illnesses. The few surgical procedures attempted were performed without anesthesia or antiseptic techniques. Patients died from shock, blood loss, or infections that invariably followed crude operations. Purging treatments using powerful laxatives caused dehydration that could kill weakened patients within days. Heat treatments for fevers wrapped patients in layers of clothing, often pushing them into deadly heat stroke. Perhaps most tragically, combination treatments multiplied these dangers. A single patient might receive bloodletting, toxic herbs, and ritualistic burning simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of medical catastrophe that made survival nearly impossible. Chapter 5. The Lucky Few Who Survived. In 1798, a merchant's daughter named Oshizu from Osaka survived smallpox through what her family called a miracle, but which was actually the result of careful nursing, adequate nutrition, and pure chance that her particular infection was less severe than those that killed her neighbors. Survival from serious illness in feudal Japan required a combination of factors that had little to do with medical treatment and everything to do with individual constitution, family resources, and extraordinary luck. The patients most likely to survive serious illnesses were those who received supportive care rather than aggressive medical intervention. Families who kept sick members comfortable, provided adequate fluids, and avoided dangerous treatments gave their loved ones the best chance of recovery. Nutritional status before illness struck was crucial for survival outcomes. Well-fed individuals from wealthy families had immune systems better equipped to fight infections, while malnourished peasants often lacked the physical reserves needed to endure serious diseases. Geographic isolation sometimes protected communities from the worst epidemic diseases, allowing populations to develop immunity patterns that increased survival rates when diseases eventually arrived. Remote mountain villages might experience less severe outbreaks than urban areas. Age and timing factors influenced survival significantly. Adults who contracted childhood diseases like measles often died at higher rates than children, while people who survived early exposure to diseases might develop immunity that protected them during later epidemics. Family resources determined access to better food, cleaner water, and more comfortable living conditions during illness. Wealthy households could provide sick rooms with better ventilation, cleaner bedding, and more attentive care than poor families living in crowded conditions. Traditional nursing practices, particularly those maintained by women in families, often provided more effective support than formal medical treatments. Grandmothers and mothers developed practical knowledge about caring for sick family members that emphasized comfort and basic hygiene. Some folk remedies, purely by coincidence, had beneficial effects that helped patients recover. Certain herbal teas provided hydration and mild nutrients, while some traditional foods contained compounds that supported immune function. Early recognition of symptoms, sometimes allowed families to implement supportive care before diseases progressed to life-threatening stages. Experienced older family members could identify serious illnesses and respond with appropriate rest and nutrition. Seasonal timing affected survival outcomes significantly. Diseases contracted during harvest season when food was abundant had different mortality patterns than those occurring during spring when stored food supplies were exhausted. Community support networks could provide resources that individual families couldn't afford alone. Neighbors might share nursing duties, provide special foods, or contribute resources needed for extended illness care. Religious and psychological support, while not medically effective, could provide comfort and hope that helped patients endure the stress of serious illness. Faith could reduce anxiety and depression that might otherwise weaken recovery efforts. The gradual introduction of more effective treatments through Dutch medical knowledge provided slightly better outcomes for the few patients who had access to these new approaches, though such access remained extremely limited throughout most of the period. Chapter 6. The Price of Being Sick. In 1815, a widow named Oyuki from Kai province found herself facing an impossible choice after her husband died of tuberculosis. The medical expenses had consumed their rice reserves and forced her to borrow against next year's harvest. Now the moneylender demanded payment. She could either sell her 6-year-old daughter into service or lose the family's small plot of land forever. Illness in feudal Japan created financial catastrophes that often outlasted the diseases themselves, destroying family prosperity and condemning survivors to generations of poverty. Medical treatments required payments that could bankrupt peasant families. A single consultation with a respected doctor might cost more than a farming family earned in months, money spent on treatments that rarely worked. The loss of agricultural labor created compounding crises. Sick farmers couldn't tend their fields during crucial seasons, leading to reduced harvests that affected family survival for years after recovery. Healthy family members abandoned their productive work to provide nursing care, creating household labor shortages when income was most needed. Special food requirements forced families to purchase expensive items they normally couldn't afford. Doctors prescribed rare ingredients and imported medicines that cost more than ordinary families spent on food in months. Borrowing money for medical expenses created debt relationships that trapped families in cycles of poverty lasting generations. Interest rates on emergency loans were predatory, and families often lost their land or homes to creditors after unsuccessful treatments failed to save their loved ones. Conclusion. The experience of falling sick in feudal Japan reveals the terrifying fragility of life in a world where medical knowledge offered more danger than hope. Yet from this harsh reality emerged something remarkable: communities and families that developed extraordinary resilience in the face of medical helplessness. Unlike societies that placed unlimited faith in their medical systems, Japanese families learned to focus on practical care, emotional support, and community solidarity that often proved more effective than formal treatments. They created survival strategies based on realistic assessments of what medicine could and couldn't accomplish. The women who nursed sick family members, the communities that supported afflicted households, and the individuals who survived against impossible odds weren't just lucky. They represented human adaptability at its most essential. They found ways to preserve hope and maintain care even when cure was impossible. Their legacy challenges our assumptions about medical authority and effectiveness. While we now have treatments that actually work, their experience reminds us that healing involves more than technical intervention. It requires human connection, practical wisdom, and the courage to care for each other despite uncertainty. The next time you take modern medicine for granted, remember the families of feudal Japan who faced illness with nothing but their love for each other and their determination to endure. They discovered that while we cannot always cure, we can always care, and sometimes that caring makes all the difference between despair and hope. Thanks for watching. In the next episode, we'll discover how women endured marriage and duty in samurai households, where honor mattered more than happiness, and where a wife's survival depended on navigating deadly political intrigue within her own home.